So, I am going to talk about my career path only because I can kind of fit in some of our learning objectives. So I'm going to use that as a sort of backdrop. The two that I really want to focus on, the two learning objectives I'd like to cover in my time, would be finding new clients and earning a fee, earning a living in this work. So I think those might be two of, if we prioritize the learning objectives, which I actually do with my class, but haven't done with you all, I would imagine that those are pretty important, because I think for you getting started, it's great to know the sort of sophisticated skills once you're rolling, but you know, those first steps are sometimes the hardest. So, and you'll probably be relieved by all the kind of dumb things I did, so it might not seem so hard after I share that with you. So let's have the first slide, Elizabeth. Oh, well, there's that idea. Thank you. So I was, making a lot of fun of that MoMA show, but I have to admit that I am totally guilty myself of almost exactly the same thing, and so I shouldn't be so high and mighty about that project, because after I got out of Yale, I went to work for Stephen Hall's office, which was the office I wanted to work for in the whole world, and one of the projects we were doing was a project for Phoenix, Arizona, and it was funded by the Graham Foundation for the Fine Arts, a very prestigious, fancy foundation, and it was going right into the Museum of Modern Art. But nobody in the office had ever been to Phoenix, Arizona, and it never occurred to anybody in the office to actually talk to somebody from Phoenix, Arizona. So I am absolutely as guilty as the participants of the Foreclosed show, but that was also when I started to realize that what we were doing in that office might be meaningful for us and, a few other people who like to go to MoMA shows, but had nothing to contribute to Phoenix, Arizona. So that is sort of when I realized that traditional architecture wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. When you get to that point of sort of seeing your career in front of you and saying, is this one I want to put all of my hard work, all of my hard-earned education into? It's a critical moment to say, maybe that's not how I want to spend my life. So now I had one wonderful opportunity of seeing an alternative to that approach, which was just a happy coincidence of meeting somebody after my first year of grad school. I met a guy in New Orleans. He said, well, come up to our office in Jackson. And my first job had been with Richard Rogers in London, so I'm, super snobby, right? I'm like, Jackson, Mississippi, seriously? Anyway, so I go up, and instead of Tom Howarth, who I met, this guy comes out with his big old beard, and it's Sambo Mockbee. And this was in 1986, so 7 years before he started the Rural Studio. But Sambo Mockbee was one of the most lovable, wonderful characters you could ever meet. So by the end of lunch, of course, he said, let's go have lunch. And so we sort of ate together, and he showed me some of their work, and he had done one charity house, as he called it. And he had done this house only because he kept driving by this family who had built their own house, and there were children. And so he got some money together and got volunteers, and they just built a house. And so that was really the first house at Sambo, the first so-called charity house, but using his skills to design for people who don't usually get to design. And I saw that house, and he said, well, here's what happened. The newspaper, the local newspaper, the Clarion Ledger, drove by the house, and so they called me up and said, why don't you put together a proposal to build 3 more houses, and we'll put in a grant to the Gannett Foundation, is their corporate foundation, and if we get it, you can build these 3 houses. So that was the lucky moment that I met Sambo, and he hired me to do that project, to be the design director for these three houses. So, yeah, maybe not. So I actually want to start off my time by talking about poetry, okay? Because I want you all to understand that poetry is a very important part of, well, I'll just speak for myself. Poetry is an important part of what I try and do in design, but poetry is also a very important part of public interest design. I don't want you all to see, we have beautiful formal design over here and public interest design over here, and there's no connection between what I'm learning in my studio and public interest design. And for me, the connection between the desire to have beauty and formal compositional elegance and public interest design is what I consider poetry. And let me just say what I mean by that. And I'll give you this example. So here's one of the three families that we found. Actually, we didn't find them. We worked with, it was a great idea. We teamed up with the United Way and also a Catholic sister who actually served people in this rural area. And she helped us identify three families that she thought would benefit from this idea. So this is the Luckett family. And, I always feel like I'm privileged to serve the clients I have. I mean, the Luckett family, extremely low income, but just, you could just feel the love they had for each other. They were very proud of the children's education. They had all these book awards on their walls. At the same time, there was holes in their ceiling. And Mr. Luckett,
is it on?
Why not? Mr. Luckett's job was, he actually was a pulpwood hauler, which is sort of the rural equivalent of collecting aluminum cans. You get scraps of wood and you take it to a paper mill. And he had two trucks, neither of which had a hood on them, but he would take parts off of one truck to repair the other truck. And at this time, it was actually true that if he had left the family, they would have made more with aid to families with dependent children than he was making as a pulpwood hauler. But that was out of the question. They were such a core family, and they also had the opportunity of moving to the city to live in hut housing. Now, let me just say, this house had no plumbing inside. They had a tap out by the street to get the water. So it was rough conditions, and they could have moved to Jackson to live in hut housing, but their roots, their culture had always been rural. That's who they were. So this family, one of the things I sort of learned in this experience is when you are at low-income poverty, your values are very clear. In sort of my middle-class existence, I can sort of do everything and don't really have to prioritize much. But for this family, their values were just absolutely clear, and it was really a struggle every day to even maintain them. So Mrs. Luckett, they would have these family rituals, even though there was no water here at the sink. She acted like, a typical family would, of washing the dishes, which is not surprising, but it really wasn't the way the sink worked. So I want to talk about innovation, because I think that's, there are a lot of ways to be innovative, and making up sort of random form usually has the appearance of innovation. And I think we were innovative in a different way in this project. So I don't want to say there are public interest design where formal innovation is absolutely appropriate. I don't think sort of extravagant forms was the idea here, but we were kind of struggling with the idea of what are we going to do, and we had that precedent of that one house Sambo had done for the Johnson family. And so we decided that what we wanted to do was try and express and celebrate who each of these families were, even on a tight budget. The budget was about $25,000. So I was driving home to New Orleans, and I stopped and I saw this this pelleting mill, and it was sort of a nice relationship between the trucks that would pull in through here. And anyway, this is the house we came up with for the Johnsons. You know, it's not radical, but it's actually pretty traditional Southern colonial in a sense, except that we carved away where the living room would be, well, the living room here, and then this became the porch for the truck, so he could have it under cover and work on it. And, you know, when the father was home, sort of completed the composition, and very, very economic building. So we did 3 of these houses, and, you know, the floor plan had a sleeping loft. There were 2 girls and a boy. They also had a study area. Very tight floor plan, but so here's what happened. So that's what I learned from Sambo, that poetry comes from people also. Poetry is not just about the play of light on forms and materials. Poetry is from people. That people, and Sambo's process was just to believe that there was always poetry, and no matter who he was serving, no matter how under-resourced they may appear to everyone else, that if you talk with them and you respect them, there is something wonderful and unique about them that can be expressed in their architecture. So that's my first message for you, is we should always be looking for the poetry, not just the solution to these incredible global challenges, but we're also designers, we're also are artists. I mean, poetry is part of what we're doing, okay? And I want to be clear about that and just show you how I approach that in my own work. But also this aspect of respect and expressing people for who they are and celebrating them in the design we do for them. Now, here's what happened. So we finished these 3 designs, we applied for the grant, and we didn't get it. So it goes back to the questions Catherine brought up yesterday, is like, are the possible clients disappointed? Well, we were all disappointed, I mean, no doubt about it. But we had been really clear with the families that this was not a sure thing. And I would say that the real problem was we didn't really spend much time with the families. We met with the families twice each, but we didn't go back with the design, and we didn't say, you know, iterate, give me your feedback. To me, that was the process failure. And as much as I love Sambo and his work, he didn't really do it that way. And I remember a story from Ms. Bryan, who lived in the first straw bale house that they did. Amazing house. I mean, the house that really inspired me that this actually could be done. That was the house he did after this failure. And I remember looking at the Bryant's furniture in the house and thinking how great that furniture looked in that house, you know. It wasn't from IKEA, it was their furniture, and it looked awesome in the house. But I remember Ms. Bryan saying to me that Sambo had said, we're going to build you a house out of straw. And she didn't see him again until they showed up with the building materials. And she said she and Shepard were talking the whole time about how they were going to keep the cows from eating the house. So I will just say, like I said, nobody's doing this perfectly, and as much of an inspiration as Sambo was for a lot of us, there were things in his process that I think we've learned since then, which was, I think he started the Rural Studio in '93. So that's just a little bit of why I had an ability to not be happy at Stephen Hall's office and just sort of say, I think there's something else out there. Again, we hadn't actually built this. And I try and figure out why we didn't get funded by the Gannett Foundation, and we were not very good grant writers, clearly. But I think we failed to explain the impact in a meaningful way. And my guess is they looked at this and says, why are they designing for poor people? Design is a luxury for wealthy people. Well, the fact is that the cost of these units per house was less than what the HUD rental housing cost, much less. So I think if we had explained this in a different way, that this was actually a pretty innovative approach to affordable housing, it was a more responsive solution for less money and respectful of who people are, I think we would have gotten the grant. So, lesson learned, but you know, not a success. But it did give me this feeling that this was possible. So, I went to Stephen Hall's office, and well, just in this context, another thing he said to a magazine was, I agreed to do this client's house because the client promised not to interfere in the design. So you can see that that's a different approach than Sambo. And I would submit to you that if Stephen designs for 2% and Sambo designed for the 98%, don't you think the 2% would want that kind of respect as well? I mean, I don't think, you know, I don't have a design process for the 98% and another one for the 2%. I have, you know, I think a lot of this is about respect for our clients, our end users, and working with them to find a solution. And I don't see that that's something appropriate for 2% either, in any case. So while I was at Stephen's office, my sister was working in central Pennsylvania with migrant farm workers. And she was, she speaks Haitian Creole, so she was going around with legal services and inspecting the housing for code violations. And she was sending me photographs of the housing, and here I was, you know, doing what I thought irrelevant stuff in New York, and I just felt like, wow, I'm gonna go out there and see how I can contribute design to these people who, in my opinion, at this point, maybe my opinion only, could use design. So here's the first way to get funded. And you guys are going to be way better than this. Well, if you read your homework, you're already better than this. So I was walking down the hall at Yale, and I saw a sign on the wall that said AIA scholarships, post-graduation scholarships. And I looked at that, and it was a $2,500 grant to do research after you graduated. So I took one of my, I had taken a class and sort of wrote this manifesto, you know, out of frustration after going back to Yale after working with Sambo. Anyway, I wrote this 35-page paper. So I said, great. So I submitted that paper to the AIA grant program. And do you think that I got that grant? No. Please realize that I should not have gotten that grant, because a bad grant application is something you sit down at your desk and you just write and you just make up by yourself. And you have no verification that, you know, anybody else finds a value in this. So just keep that in mind as lesson number one about grants. Just like we've talked about the seed process. Who else is involved in this project? How do we know that they value the project? How are they going to confirm that, right? These are all things that make a great grant application. So I reapplied. I actually got some photographs of the bad housing, had like 1/20th of the text, made it much more easy to communicate. Frankly, nobody else would have read that 30-page paper except for my professor, who was paid to read it. I mean, you know. So the second time I did get funded for $2,500. So the lesson here is always keep in mind what the grant, you're competing. There are other people applying for these grants. You have to communicate value concisely and clearly in a grant application, which is really something to do anyway. You know, to do a good job in public interest design, you want to know, you want to understand what you're doing and be very clear about it, and hopefully concise to communicate with other people and other stakeholders. So now I have $2,500 in my pocket, plus a very meaningful sort of pat on the back from the AIA. The bad news is they don't have this program anymore, I'm afraid to say. So it's not something you all could get. But it was lucky for me because it gave me enough courage to move out to central Pennsylvania. And let me just say, there wasn't even an architect to give me a job in this county. There was no architect in this county. But Adams County is a beautiful, unbelievably beautiful part of the country. Miles and miles of apple trees, sort of topiary by the mile. So, what do you think I did? Let's see what good ideas you have. You all know much more than I did, believe me. I'm out there. Like I said, I never had any conversation about this except for the opportunity with Sambo. What would you do? Start talking to people. Great. Who would you talk to?
The people who live in the community.
Okay.
Shareholders, I guess. The need, find out what
Right.
the need was, and
Right.
where you could fit in.
Right. So this is a moment where you want to do a stakeholder exercise and say, who are all the stakeholders involved in this? I knew migrants were, but they're very difficult. Most of them are living on the farm, on private property, and unless you're legal services, you're not allowed on there. So the first thing I did was volunteer for legal services so I could go on and inspect the housing and kind of do my homework. My attitude, sort of reaction to Stephen Hall's office and sort of the way I've been taught at Yale, instead of thinking I know everything, was to say I know nothing about farm workers and I need to do my homework. So that gave me an opportunity of going on private property, and it was valuable for legal services because I had a master's degree in architecture. I could read, you know, the farm worker code is like 25 pages of like how many square feet has to be. It's not too hard to be able to assess the code violations. So that was the one stakeholder I had. Now let me give you all this assignment. I think this is a really good assignment, and we sort of did it with Ingrid. But when you're doing a project, I'd encourage you to try and find 10 stakeholders, okay? When we did that little map, that matrix, we came up with 6, so pretty quickly. But it starts to get hard when you're trying to think of 10. But it really is good to push you to think about people you might not be thinking about. And remember, you can include yourself, so that's only 9 others. But it's a good exercise to make you think, because I had no idea. The only place I could think of to contact was the housing authority. Because I'd heard a rumor that they were doing some housing for migrants. Well, guess what? It's sort of like a Paul Farmer moment. I kept trying to call the executive director of the housing authority, wouldn't talk to me. And I finally got him on the phone. He said, we already got an architect. And I was just trying to volunteer to be able to understand what I could contribute, right? I couldn't even give away free services. That's, you know, sort of the value that he had for a designer at that moment. Finally, I was able to meet with him because, you know, it was the only stakeholder I could think of. So I had to keep calling him. And he ended up being a great friend. We worked together for years, but at this moment, didn't want anything to do with me. So, and that's a really important thing, is to understand what you can offer to them, understand what their stake is, you know, and be able to articulate how you can help it, right? You're not trying to say, oh, you need design, because that's what I got. You're trying to say, look, you're trying to serve low-income people. Anyway, we finally worked on projects together in the county, and I did a lot of projects with the housing authority, but I couldn't articulate any stake we shared. But I did go he finally got to meet with him. He said, oh, you don't want to talk to me, you want to talk to Rural Opportunities. They're a nonprofit in Harrisburg that's serving only farm workers. That's all they serve, and they have a housing program, and they're renovating housing, farm worker housing. So another lesson learned there is you're never going to make the right first phone call to the right person magically the first time, but always try and have them put their expertise to use to get you to the next person. And that might not be the right person either. So you go again. You just don't want the dead end, right? Especially if you can only think of one stakeholder. A dead end is pretty deadly. So, I went to meet with Rural Opportunities. And so now we're getting to a point of how you find new projects. This one I did right. So here you are, you know who you want to work with. The amazing thing I found about Rural Opportunities was they not only had housing, they had migrant health, migrant education, migrant job training, migrant Head Start. So this one office had all these professionals that could tell you about tuberculosis in housing or anything you needed. So it was just the perfect opportunity to learn from people who had spent their lives serving migrants with particular expertise. So I called up the housing director, and he was the only staff. There was only one person in housing. And this is what I said. I said, you know, I'm a designer. Would you be willing to work with me? I'll write a grant. And let's work together. You tell me what migrants need in their housing. I'll come up with a design. We'll apply. We'll use your 501c3 status. So again, using a partner's asset, I wasn't a nonprofit. I couldn't apply as an individual. And we'll apply, and if we get it, we'll pursue this design solution to the next stage. What do you think they said? No. Well, you've been set up to think they said no, but actually they said, what the hell? I mean, they didn't really say that, but it was kind of like, sure, you know, go ahead, you know. So that's what we did. So now if you look at, I wasn't asking too much of them. I was asking for their time and expertise. So it wasn't like I wasn't doing anything. And again, the critical question is, at that point, who's benefiting more out of this, me or them or farm workers? Well, who knows if farm workers are going to ever benefit at that point. But it was trying to ask as little as possible from them to get the maximum thing of value I could get from them, which was their expertise and their ability to do housing, which I didn't know anything about. So that's a lesson about finding projects. It's a little bit like an RFP conversation in a way. What do you have? What do they have? I mean, I think an RFP is better because you can put it out and there'll be, you know, hopefully more people looking at it. So I only had one. It was an RFP for one person, basically. But he was good enough to say, okay, let's do that. So much of this is relational. And going back to talk to people, so just in talking to people, and sort of that lesson from Sambo, he said, well, you know what, we have this position available, housing developer. And you know what architects think of housing or developers, it's like being the devil. You know, how would you like, our job description is being the devil. Are you interested in that? And I'm like, yeah. So, but I realized that, you know, a developer knew how to get housing built, which I knew nothing about. And so what I said back, and you can hear this sort of negotiation of like who has a stake and who's getting what. I said, look, I'll do your job description for 40 hours a week, and I'll do design and overtime, unpaid overtime. And if after 2 years it seems that design is actually contributing to the job description, would you be willing to change the job description at that point and also change that title to housing designer? And he said yes. So first day I go to work, he says, can you go look at that site and see how many housing units we can put on there? Which is the kind of thing you don't get to do that in New York very much, you know. So they needed design, they just didn't, you know, back to Eric's question, how do you define design? They didn't consider that design at all, but it was like, wow, just me? You know, I mean, in Stephen's office, we were like fighting like mad dogs for scraps of design. You know, here it's like, hey, you like to design? Please go at it. So it turned out to be an amazing opportunity. I worked there for 5 years, and what I learned was the model for paying for affordable housing, which is not, you know, I didn't make it up. It's very standard process. You know, it might be a career of interest to some of you, but I think what happened for me at that point was I became a hybrid, because I was still a designer, but now I knew how to be a developer. So that hybrid has meant everything to me in my education. And so after 2 years, we changed the job description, and I stayed there 3 more years. So I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but just understand there are professions where people get paid and make a living that are not, they might not say design in the job description, but as a designer, you can find that opportunity. So, and this was my career for it continued, but for 5 years at Rural Opportunities, okay? So another way of looking for a job is not to look for the job that says designer, but look for the interest of yours, the passion of yours that's in a different field that will keep you, motivated because you're serving the people you want to serve. But you find the way to bring design into that. And that's what I did. And I loved it. So here's some of the housing we inspected. This was a chicken coop. They put people in. The doors were all about this high. I don't know why. I guess chickens, or I don't know. For whatever reason, the doors inside were this high. And you can see there were structural issues. Outhouses meet code. Farm workers have their own special code. Outhouses. This is a particularly disgusting one because it was painted dark green inside. And it was a triple holer. It is, In any case, so what I started doing was identifying some typologies. And farm market housing has really only occurred since World War II. It's a pretty recent typology. Because before World War II, if you've read Grapes of Wrath, you know that the local families would harvest the crops. And they'd actually close the schools in Adams County for the kids to go harvest the crops. But after World War II, there were no more family farms. Everybody had full-time jobs and nobody could pick, so that's when they had to start bringing the workforce from other states, and that's when they needed housing. But anyway, so what I did was I did my homework, and I studied the housing, tried to come up with typologies, tried to learn, tried to have conversations with the farm workers, and find out what was good and what was bad. So, now, in terms of engagement techniques, the first thing I tried to do was have a conversation in the housing with the farm worker. Well, guess what? Finally, one guy passed me a note, and it said something on it about the housing. And I was like, why is he passing me a note? And then it occurred to me that the housing is owned by their employer, and if they complain about their housing, they could easily be fired. So my participatory technique was not very good to begin with, but now we have a very different way of doing it. But I did get to learn about the housing. Now let me just say a little bit more about my process, which I call asset-based design. And there are two university professors, John Kretzmann and John McKnight, who have something called asset-based development. And that is the belief that the resources and the decision-making should come from the community, not be a top-down, like, I'm here to help you. It's sort of like Dick, right? Like, I'm here to help you. This is more of a participatory process, and I don't know if you've read this essay in Expanding Architecture, but it's really the story of Stone Soup, where this dog is homeless and wanders into a town. He's hungry, and he finds a stone on the way in, but he says, oh, this looks like a nice town. Somebody will give me a meal. And he starts going around, knocking on doors. Nobody will give him anything. So he goes into the middle of town and says, I'm going to make stone soup. So people kind of peek out. Somebody says, well, I'll lend you a pot. We give it back. Somebody says, I'll give you some water. Somebody says, well, I've got some extra carrots. So they end up making this soup that actually feeds everybody, and they have a great party and creates social capital. So this is pretty literally my design process, which is to say that everybody brings something to, and an idea can be something contributed to the process, right? A decision made is something contributed to the process. So this isn't this guy's soup anymore. This is the neighborhood creation, and everybody sort of come out and met their neighbors. So think about this as a way of, so the designer, the public interest designer, is this character here, right? You sort of become the catalyst for things happening. You don't hand them out a French recipe and say, go make this. And that soup sort of represents what that community had, right? So that soup was created by that community and is sort of unique for that community. So that's sort of the parable for my design process. So going back to migrant workers, what I found was there's billions of dollars. What I found at Rural Opportunities, there's billions of dollars the federal government spends every year on migrant housing. But guess what? No designers involved in it. And it's actually the program that started back in the days when Dorothy Lang was hired. Dorothy Lang took this photograph as a government employee. She was hired by the government to show the problems and why we needed this new program, which was called the Resettlement Administration. There you see her photograph used in the advocacy poster for the Resettlement Administration. Then it became Farmers Home, and now it's called Rural Development, which is like a federal department, sort of like HUD, but it serves rural populations. So that's another, so guess who's paid my salary for those 5 years? The U.S. Department of Agriculture. They might not even know they've paid a designer for 5 years. But their mission is U.S. agriculture. If you don't have farm workers, you can't pick these crops. If you don't have housing, you don't have farm workers. So housing is an agricultural issue, and good design became my mission. So that's how. So here's another lesson. When you tap into a new issue, you tap into unbelievable other resources to pay for your career, okay? No matter what the issue is, there are ecosystems that pay people in those issues, you know, what they need to live. So again, this isn't like saying, I want to be a designer, who's going to pay for a designer? You have to say, what is an issue I'm interested in? How can a designer play a role here? And how are these other people getting paid? And you bring design into that issue. And then and guess what? If you do something like migrant housing, you're like the national expert because there are not a lot of other people doing it. So it's a great way to sort of establish a niche as a designer because you found a way of bringing design to an issue that people haven't really associated with design before. Any questions at this point? So that's another way of getting your career funded, is look at other issues and what are the ecosystems that provide jobs within that issue, and then how can you bring design in? And it might take you a year or two to figure it out, how to bring design in. So here's some of the beautiful Pennsylvania architecture or vernacular. So what we did, this was my first results of that prototype. We actually got funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, because guess what they told me? They said, we don't usually get letters of support with little fruits up at the top, you know. They're used to, like, you know, getting letters from, I don't know, museum directors in New York, I guess. But so we had letters of support from all the stakeholders involved in migrant housing, which they're a public agency. They want to serve the public. They saw that the public was saying, we need this grant funded. So we got $45,000 from the NEA. And so this was that first prototype we did. And I didn't know anything about manufactured housing, and I didn't know enough to be very creative, but we got a porch on it, and we got metal siding, which I wanted to use. So here they are going in. So I had the opportunity, so here's how this works. Let me tell you about standard HUD funding. If you look at a pro forma, if you remember, somebody asked if you know what a pro forma is. So pro forma is the budget. If you look at a HUD or rural development pro forma, there's a line item for architect, capped at 6%. Well, most architects can't do a project for 6%. But guess what? You look down the next line, developer's fee, 20%. This is getting interesting. The next line, indirect, 10%. So all of a sudden, if you're a developer, if you're a hybrid developer designer, you have 37% of the project budget that you can play with. So guess what? You can take a little more fee. And guess what? You can put 20% back into the project and pay for really heavy gauge metal siding that's going to last for 20 years. And you can pay for a porch. And you can pay for what you want to. So even in these strict sort of limited HUD budgets, instead of taking the money out as developers' fees, as a developer, you have the ability to pay yourself and pay for higher quality construction. But I also had the opportunity, so what we do, and this is probably the biggest takeaway of my project. So you remember that chart that Ingrid had? Down at the bottom was, what was it?
No influence.
What was it?
No influence.
No influence. Well, guess where migrant workers are, okay? They're down here, especially if they're undocumented. You know, they're not going to complain much because they're worried about consequences. So but that's who I was serving, right? So here's the model we came up with. So we saw farmers as stakeholders. Legal services saw farmers as the enemy, and they would sue them. And sometimes they'd pay a fine, the farmer would pay a fine, or sometimes they'd close down the housing. That doesn't really help the farm workers very much. So we saw the farmer as a stakeholder, and so what we said to the farmer is, if you will put our design on your property, and you will only charge this much rent, and you will do all these other things we tell you to do, we'll pay for half the construction cost of this unit. And that's the money we got from rural development. Well, guess what? Rural development's happy because they're used to paying for 100% of the project. Now, they've got more than 50% paid for because the land is also not included in the cost. So they just cut their costs. You're asking them for a third of what they usually pay for a project. So the government is happy. So that's a win. Check. So the farmer says, okay, so this is for 4 people. It's 725 square feet. The code says 400 square feet, okay? And after measuring all those buildings, I know that farmers build exactly 100 square feet per person. But we don't think that was enough. So we have 4 people in here for 725 square feet. So, but we don't, so what I say to the farmer is, I am not your architect, I'm not your designer. I need access to your workers without you there to talk with them about the design for the housing. So what I just did, I took the, what was it?
No influence.
No influence, and put them at the top of the design decision making. So that to me is the big success of what I did, because it's usually the farmer that made the design decisions, and because we brought in this other money, it also paid me. He didn't pay me, so I was not working for the farmer, right? But so the farmer's getting 50% subsidy, which he thinks is great. Now, we didn't just give it to the farmer, we actually put a lien against his property, and if he didn't do all the things we said for 20 years, he had to pay it back, okay? So this is how, but you know, farmers signed up. We had lots of farmers doing this project. And so it was a win for farm workers, it was a win for farmers, it was a win for the government, it was a win for me, and a win for rural opportunities. This was the first new construction we were able to do. Now, one of the other things the farmers liked about it, there, you know, again, I'm simplifying things, but there's a lot of conversations involved in this. They liked that they could move this if they had to, you know, sometimes like tobacco, for example, sometimes you stop growing a particular crop. Like North Carolina, now nobody's growing tobacco, they're all growing blueberries. Well, blueberries are in a different place than where you can grow tobacco. So if you had built permanent housing in one place, now you don't have it. So that was a real advantage for the farmer also. Yes?
In what you're talking about with the lien practice that you did,
Yes.
how did you work or navigate that? Because I would think once you place the lien, there'd be some sort of legal obligation to just go on with that.
So 1/10, yeah, no, there are
Well, I mean on your side, like to place a lien and then to, would you?
So 1/20th of the lien was forgiven per year.
Oh, okay.
Right. So it sort of automatically expired unless we found a violation.
Okay.
So what I got to do was go back every year and inspect it, but I like to go back and just hear what they had to say. I didn't have any post-occupancy process at that point, but I just like to go back and hear, and of course they thought it was great. I mean, it was great for my, you know, feeling like I had accomplished something because they were really happy about it. But what I also found was that original unit was designed either for single workers or for families. And what we found out was that the farmers weren't going to put families in there because they have bed spaces, and they want farm workers there. So the next iteration was this unit, which was specifically for single guys. And the single guys, in my surveys, I found out, well, we want to come and make some money, but we want to go home. We're not trying to move to central Pennsylvania. And so that's where this sort of metaphor of mobility came from, and it sort of, you saw that little corn crib that was detached from the ground, sort of the same idea here. And other things like, one of the problems in most housing is somebody goes into the bathroom after work and shuts the door, and everybody else goes into the kitchen with all the pesticides on them because the bathroom is now closed because somebody's taking a shower. So what we did was we put a sink right inside here. This is a little porch, so people could leave their baskets and their shoes here and wash off right there before either going in to make dinner or. So there are other things about this that were particular for the farm workers. So here they are, and now I know a lot about manufactured housing. I could get anything I wanted, including curved roof, hardy panel, natural galvanized metal. And one other point, so that first unit you saw had 2 bedrooms, and this unit has 1 bedroom. Well, guess what? When we would go back to inspect the housing, the 2 bedrooms, we thought that they would put their TV in the living dining room area and watch TV up there, but they're so exhausted from this incredibly strenuous work that they would go watch TV in the bedrooms. Well, what happens if you have 2 bedrooms? You have to put the TV in one and the other guys come and lie on the floor. So I said to them, well, would you rather have 1 bedroom for 4 people or 2 bedrooms for 5 people? And they preferred 1 bedroom for 4 people. So here you see where the TV goes. Here's their lockers. Here's where the bed goes. This is Kendra Welch, who is a Rice graduate, who's acting like a model or something, but she was really responsible for this whole thing, and she grinds steel like better than anybody ever saw. So she's a wonderful, she was a fellow we had. Anyway, this was really her project at this point. And now the thing about it is, we saved 40 square feet by going from 2 bedrooms to 1 bedroom because we had this hallway, which is a waste. No, the hallway doesn't do anything for anybody. So this is one little incident of saying that better design doesn't necessarily cost more. Because this costs cheaper per person because we could eliminate a hallway. And they liked it better. Okay. All right, so Elizabeth's going to start shooting notes at me. So like I said about being an expert is, you take an issue like this, and there are not a lot of other designers involved in it. So I got a phone call from Florida Legal Services, who had heard about what we were doing, and said, can you come down here and do a prototype? We just had a hurricane come through, and it wiped out a lot of migrant housing. Fortunately, the migrants were not there at the time. They were up the stream, but they're coming back. There's going to be a lot of federal money. We don't want bad temporary housing. We want good permanent solutions. And they said, we'll give you $10,000 to do a prototype. So I said, sure. So here's some of the housing that got hit by this hurricane. Migrant housing in Florida is where like old manufactured housing goes to die. Now this unit was actually not damaged by the hurricane, so you can see how bad these are without that, and they're awful places to live. So here's what we came up with, and this is our brochure to convince farmers why this is in their interest. It doesn't talk about, I'm not trying to convert them to be a socialist. I'm saying, look, this is a good business idea for you. This thing is easy to clean. This thing is energy efficient. Yes, it has air conditioning, which they wouldn't usually put in here, but look at the price. You get them to focus on what's good for them and the price they're paying, and that they're able to make a decision on that, right? That's their stake. You don't talk about how you exceed code and how it's good for the farm worker. That's not their stake. Although there are a lot of farmers that want the same workers to come back. so they don't have to train new workers. So there is an incentive for their workforce to actually be happy and want to come back. And actually in Pennsylvania, there was a farmer, the guys would call from Mexico and they would ask him, is the housing available? They wouldn't ask him if he had a job. They said, is the housing? So that was nice. Anyway, so here's the brochure kind of explaining to farmers why they should buy it. And one of the great things about manufactured housing is they didn't pay until it arrived on the site. So there's no construction financing. They know exactly how much it's going to cost. They know exactly when it's going to get there. And it made their decision-making process really easy. It also gave me an excuse to say, look, I'm not redesigning this. This is already pre-designed. In other words, don't mess with this. You're not going to cut 200 square feet out of this unit. So, but again, we had a great participatory process through social service agencies down there, and that's why we had things like air conditioning. But here's the other lesson here. So, and this is another way we make money.
I have a
Yes,
question. This
yes.
is something I noticed on that. Does that flip up and protect that wall there?
It doesn't protect the wall, but for travel, it.
Oh, I was thinking because it said hurricane resistant.
No, it
so
is. It is
I
hurricane
was thinking
resistant.
that maybe that flipped up and protected that wall of windows.
Actually, you don't have to. This resists 130 mile an hour winds without that going on. So the first time we got a price, it was for $75,000. And that was modular. And I won't go into all the details, but modular needs a whole foundation and comes in on the truck. Then I found a group called Townhomes. This guy was third generation in this industry. Now, do you think, his name is Gary Towns. Is Gary Towns a stakeholder? Yes. Does he have an expertise that I need? Yes. You better believe it. Amazing. He took the same specifications that cost $75,000, he reduced the price to $45,000. And guess what? That price was so low, we didn't need a government subsidy. We add $5,000 onto it and sell them for $50,000. So one other way we make a product, we make a profit, we pay our salaries, is by selling a product and putting a fee on it. And now all I do is I get a phone call. I call up Gary. I say, has the price changed at all? He'll tell me if there's been any fluctuation. I give the price to the farmer, and I tell him when it can be delivered or confirm that he can get it when he needs it, and I make $5,000. Now, I will say that we have a really good legal agreement, that we had free legal services, and one of the things that's lacking in public interest design is this whole spectrum of legal agreements that we don't have. It's one of the things we need to get. But this legal agreement, I keep the intellectual property, but the liability for the unit goes from the manufacturer to the farmer. So I don't have any liability, which is probably more than you need to know, but you know, it's just a point that lawyers should be our friends, and we need their help. These are some other housing units we've done. This is one we're doing now in North Carolina for blueberry workers. The idea here is that half of it is built in the factory and half of it is sort of a cheap lean-to, like a lot of people do with manufactured housing. They put a cheap addition on, which makes economic sense, so that's what we're doing here. We put this, so if you saw this thing coming down the highway, you'd see the kitchen sort of facing you. And anyway, that's, let's see. I guess the one thing, two last points. We actually do home ownership for people too, because a lot of farm workers want to get out of the migrant stream if they have a family. So we've done home ownership where we design, sort of like what we try to do with Sambo. We design individual housing for them. The reason I wanted to mention this is a lot of these families don't qualify because of credit issues. So the conversation came up yesterday, how do you let them down easy from that disappointment? And what I've come to believe is that if you give them a path and say, here's what's wrong with your credit, here's how you can fix it, and when you fix it, you can buy this house, I don't think you're actually doing them any kind of like disillusionment. They probably never would have realized how to fix their credit if they hadn't come through the credit counseling process. So I don't think necessarily you just say, oh, it's a failure, I'm out of here. You sort of look at the long-term game plan, right? Now they have a goal of owning their own house that was designed just for them, and they can fix their credit, which helps in lots of other ways as well. And the other point is here, just to point out that, you know, the way we design a house isn't the way every other culture designs a house. So if we're designing for people that aren't like us, any anthropologist will tell you that you have to be really careful about putting your own cultural biases aside and really trying to start with a clean slate to understand what theirs may be. This is just a diagram of public and private spaces in the US sort of bungalow. This is public and these are all private, so there's usually a hallway. A lot of cultures in Mexico don't have that sort of issue with spatial adjacency, and when I did a survey and asked what their separation between public and private, the most common answer was mi casa, su casa. So they actually, I have friends that are married to Mexicans, and they say that people just walk in to their bedroom sometimes, which, you know, they're not really used to. But so here's the house for that farmer who didn't actually qualify, but this is the house we designed for him. And you can see it's not exactly the diagram, whoops, but there's no hallway. This is the courtyard, this is the living room, kitchen, parents, children's, anyway. So this is one last project that we decided to do a bathroom. The only reason I'm going to show this is the way we now engage farm workers in a conversation is not by talking to them in their housing unit. That was my first mistake. Now we actually we rent a booth at a flea market on Sunday afternoons, which is their free time, their only free time, and we do a survey to find out if our, you know, speculative concept about what they need is true or not. And so here's a North Carolina State student. I like to imagine she's trying to remember her high school Spanish, like how much privacy do you need in the shower or something like that. Anyway, it's a great experience for students to actually have this opportunity of face-to-face conversation with somebody. So that's what we do. And the students, we give, the people who fill out a survey, we give them something like a soda or chips or anything. And I want the students to realize they've done something for us. We haven't done anything for them at this point. So we give them something for participating in our surveys. So well, that was the design, and I just wanted to show that chicken coop that I mentioned. So here's our $600 chicken coop, and here's one of the families. So this provides 40% of the protein needed for the family to address hunger. So now we've branched off into different issues. I did start my own nonprofit after 5 years of rural opportunities because I wanted to branch out from Adams County, Pennsylvania, and there's only so many new housing units they needed per year. So that's when I decided to start my own nonprofit. It basically is a housing developer nonprofit model, but we just put design in the mission as well as providing not just housing anymore, but design services to those without access to them. So I'll just conclude by saying I've had a wonderful career. Again, I've received a salary for 24 years now, so there are ways to be paid as a public interest designer, and it's just an incredible field to work in, and it's a real privilege to serve the people that I do. Thank you.
We have 15 minutes for questions.
We have 15 minutes? Eric, good.
When you first said that you challenged us to find 10 stakeholders, I started with your first project, and you filled in a lot of it. I was having a hard time. I got to 10, but is there a master list of categories of kinds of stakeholders that exist so that if you are sort of head against a wall, you've got this thing to get back to, and like, oh wait a minute, I forgot about this class of people or this kind of organization?
It's one of our learning curves, Eric. Great idea. Sort of provocative questions, like think of another one. Well, And let me just say this, if you were, you remember we were talking about the Bancroft School and all the stakeholders they had. I really believe that if you can come up with 10 and actually, like your question, engage them in a conversation and find out what the shared their value of the project is, your project is really resilient. And not only that, you've brought in all these, it's like stone soup, right? You've got a great soup. You know, it's not just water, it's all kinds of vegetables. And so talk about two failures I had. I went all the way through the process of designing housing for the workers, with the workers. But in these two cases, the only person I was working with was the farmer and the workers. But the decision making was still only with that farmer. And in these two particular cases, the farmers changed their mind and said, we're not going to do the housing. Now, if I'd had the usual team, in other words, if one ingredient doesn't show up for that soup, you've still got soup, right? But if you've got one supplier and they say no, you're dead. So the resilience of 10 stakeholders or multiple stakeholders is you can always replace one of the stakeholders if they fail for some reason. These farmers, one guy decided to move to Hawaii, and the other guy got mad because we put he had a 24-hour work shift, and so we put these really nice blackout shades in so people during the day could sleep. And they were really nice, but it was all in the budget, and we raised the funds to pay for the whole thing. He just got mad because he thought they were too nice, so he quit. So we're dead, you know, after we raised all the money for the project. So I guess the point of the stakeholders, and it wasn't exactly your question, but you certainly see how I struggled finding stakeholders in the beginning. Just sitting there and waiting like 3 days to call back the executive director again, try and get him to talk to me. Finally, he figured he could get rid of me faster by talking to me than not. So, well, this was an interesting point. Gettysburg is the county seat of Adams County. So, do you think that the town of Gettysburg is on the National Register of Historic Places? The whole town, not just building by building, anything in the town. Do you think that the historians wanted us to build migrant housing in the town? So go back to that diagram, with us, against us, right? Historic town, all kinds of, you know, crazy historians. Do you think they were going to oppose us? Guess what? We worked together because what don't you want when you take a bus through Gettysburg is to see really bad slums, right? That doesn't go so well on your nice tour. So we did historic preservation of some of the houses and made them into migrant housing because that's how they got to preserve and we got historic tax credits that paid for 20%. We also got low-income housing tax credits. So you can't do housing on just 20%. So by themselves, they couldn't do anything. But together, so going back to that, with us, against us, how can you make the against us people with you, right? They might not care about migrant housing. They care about what they care about, and that's fine. You do something to help them with that, and it's good. Yes?
Do you know that?
I'm sorry, and then you.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Do you know that going into a situation that you're gonna have to frame something in a different perspective to get everybody on board before you start meeting with them? Do you sort of sit down and analyze what approach it's going to take, or do you only know that after you've talked for a few weeks and you think, wait, I've got to shift tax?
Let's just go back to the beginning of yesterday and think about that 98%. So we've got a lot of people to talk to and to try and explain to them, right? So I just mean this, it's always an exercise of trying to explain, and it's all iterative, you know, and just like you might think of 4, or you might think of 1 stakeholder to begin with, but you're always thinking, well, who else? And it's sort of like that phone call. Well, who can I talk to? We'll talk to them, right? So, no, I wish you could start there, but it's, you know, you might find out, well, we don't have enough money. We want to do this design, but we need 20% more. So who else can we bring in that has some funds available, right? So, but that's the exercise we need to do. That is explaining the value of design to all these diverse groups out there. And they're usually in the 98%. maybe not the historic rehab people. I guess they have, some understanding of what design is. But does that answer your question? But it's a great exercise because it's like, what's your interest in this project? And I'm not going to call it design. I'm not going to go to, it's not about convincing them for design. It's just saying, hey, this project is going to do what you need it to do in your interest, right? My tool for that is design, but did you have a question?
I was going to ask about, as far as funding, tax credits and federal funding, I know those policies always
Yes.
change. Is it the sort of thing that once you got going, you knew where to look and how to find that funding, or do you usually collaborate and have somebody that looks for those financial opportunities for you?
So, like I said about affordable housing, there's a pretty standard group of funds for any of these projects. Community Development Block Grant, State Housing Finance Agency. So the first project I did, we had 8 different funding sources, including low-income housing tax credits. Now, I wouldn't encourage any of you to try low-income housing tax credit application by yourself, unless you guys know what internal rate of return is. I somehow pretended like I knew what it was enough to get funded for it. But no, you would normally bring in a partner, right? So, and they would get a share of the fees, right? I mean, these $1 million projects are generating, sometimes $300,000 in fees. So that's a lot of fees. So it's, they're for profit. That's fine. We'll give you some profit. As long as you don't take too much, you can be a stakeholder in the project. So the kind of grants, the general grants, are very different than affordable housing because they are very sort of specialized and have to do with pro formas and how much rent you can charge and whether the housing authority has a long enough waiting list and what the fair market rents are and things like that. I mean, I did it, I don't really want to do it again. Next time I'll bring in a partner, but it was good to, it was good to do my homework because now I can say internal rate of return even if I don't know what it means and sound like I know what I'm talking. Wait, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I think you kind of answered it with the lady over there,
okay.
but like you're talking about going from like kind of like grant to grant, it's like it's kind of like hit or miss, like depending on it.
Yes.
And I was wondering like for you after like there's some failures, if you had like a specific funding model, like a specific strategy, like a funding model strategy.
I sure do. It's called SEED.
Well, yeah.
No, I'm serious. I mean, if you answer those SEED questions, you've got an amazing. I mean, even to attempt performance measures, I don't think I knew what a performance measure was until like 4 years ago. So even to know what that might look like, you're just going to have such a great grant application. And here's the other thing: you attach some sort of design. I mean, being able to put some design into a grant application, it knocks it out of the park. Because, I mean, all these other grant applications don't have a design in there, and just like my stupid 30-page paper, it's like, I don't know what this person's talking about, Whereas if you have a visual, and say, these are all the people that have worked on this design, the great thing about renderings and design is people think, oh, look, it's done, That's a bad idea in terms of Dick up here saying, it's done and I don't want any participation, but it's a great idea to show that you've already assembled a collaborative team and you've come up with this design solution, and here it is, and it's ready to go. So, well, you're not in design, so you can find a designer to work with. There are lots of them here that need you, but so does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was thinking even like on the fact like even for those just donors,
Yes.
I can't really put it in words right now. I'll have to probably come up with the question, but just like how, if there's a strategy for you for like the next project, how to bring in people who want to come to donate to you. Like,
I see.
instead of like having to go into writing out these grants and everything.
Well,
Kind of hard, it's kind of a, well, it's been wrapping around my brain. but I don't
okay.
know.
Well, this isn't answering your question, but I would like to make this point. If you go to foundationcenter.org which is one of the 4 things mentioned in the booklet, and you put in something like migrant housing, right? The great thing about Foundation Center is it's a matchmaking service, just like an RFP. It puts funders together with issues. So if your issue is like Palestinian refugees, you put that in. I happen to know you don't get any matches on that one, unfortunately, but usually you'll have, if you put in affordable housing, you'll get 1 million, but if you put in affordable housing in Adams County, Pennsylvania, you'll get a few. And so I'm not really answering your question, but this is the best way to find prospects that meet what you're trying to do. I don't raise a lot of donations. I hate asking for money. I don't mind asking foundations because that's why they're there. I mean, their job, they legally have to give away money. So I really don't. Although I had a very productive dinner last night, but I didn't have dinner with this person to try and raise money, but it just happened. So I think a lot of it is being articulate about what you're trying to do, and yeah, so it's a communication exercise, but understanding where that person might be coming from, right? Yes.
Have you ever heard of a PIDI corporation before?
Yes, I have heard of B Corporation.
Have you ever thought of doing design for that, a business model instead of a nonprofit?
I think that's, this is a new model that wasn't around when I incorporated it as a nonprofit. I think it's wonderful. I think it sort of shows the sort of expansion of socially responsible businesses as well as people who want to make money, and there's people, profit, and place, which is another version of social, economic, and environmental. I don't think the only economic is profit. That's one of the factors, so I don't like people, profit, and place particularly. But, I mean, there are people, that want to have a successful business, do right, like Tom's Shoes, or, so I think it's a great, but you know what? I don't really know much about it, and I think that's the kind of expertise you all have that, or hopefully will get, that you can share with other people. But it's somewhere in between, right? It's a for-profit that's doing good things.
It's basically structured like a C corporation, except all the profits go to helping society, except it's a benefit corporation.
Yes. Well, I mean, let me be clear about a nonprofit. A nonprofit, doesn't mean you can't. Nonprofit doesn't mean that everybody's lowly paid. It just means you don't generate profit. So it sounds like that's putting the profit back in or towards a designated recipient.
Yes.
It's very similar in a way to a 501c3. I mean, we don't generate profit, but you know what? If we do well, we can all get raises next year. So I mean, sort of the same thing. But I'm not an expert, so yes.
Have you done any projects yet or work with anyone who's doing crowdfunding?
I think crowdfunding is another great example. We did some videos there at seeddocs.org for our Seed Award winners. And by the way, if you join Seed Network, we're about to announce the new Seed Award call. But Michael Murphy was one of the award winners, and at the end of his video, he sort of made an appeal for some funding. We said, well, that's a good idea. Why don't we do that? Why don't we make these videos and have them say at the end, oh, and by the way, we need this. So the new videos that we'll be doing will have that at the end so they can be used for crowdfunding. We've looked at platforms and things like that, but we've never actually used it. So I think it's a wonderful possibility, yes.
Kind of a two-part thing. One, you had mentioned about legal kind of like contracts and that sort of stuff that was kind of lacking for designers.
Yes.
Have you found or started looking at any kind of resources that might be accessible for us to look at in that regard?
Well, I'm not doing a very good job of it. I want to do it, and part of what we were hoping with the Latrobe, funded by the AIA, was to challenge the AIA and say, now come up with a set of documents. You've got your documents for traditional architecture, now come up with ones for us. We didn't succeed in having them do that. Go ahead.
I know that the AIA does have a pro bono contract that's available that we've used as a good resource. The AIGA also has an outline of like legal recommendations and contracts for graphic artists and designers. That's been useful as well. And larger firms and organizations who do a lot of pro bono work will often have contracts that they've created for that work as well. So it never hurts to ask those larger firms or groups for those resources.
So there's a group called Association for Community Design, which is an old group that it's been around a long time. And so I asked them to do a call to their members for everybody to throw in the legal documents they have. I've got a great one for manufactured housing, but there's a lot of other things. It hasn't happened yet, but at their last board meeting I asked for that. But I do, Elizabeth brought up one other type of getting paid for a project. It's probably the most common one that I wanted to raise, and I wanted to raise it because of Catherine's presentation yesterday, which is a little bit heartbreaking to me in some ways, but the model is called deferred fee, okay? So if you remember when I was talking about Heather from Serve Denton, I said that Heather wouldn't have a project unless the designers did some work for her to get funding. Does that make sense, everybody? You can't just go to a foundation and say, give me some money and I'll tell you later what we're going to do. You need a very specific plan. Well, that's why design is so useful at that point. It is a specific plan with a specific price, and then they can get funding. So designers are very important at the beginning of these projects, right? But here's the thing. I wouldn't say, I'm going to just do pro bono and you go get the money. I'll say, I'm going to defer my fee. I'll do the design. When you get your nice project funded for $2 million, guess what? I'm your designer and I get the fee, right? So it's an investment, it's not pro bono. I don't believe in pro bono. It's not a funding model I can make work. But I do a lot of deferred fee because that's the only way these projects become realized. I'm not against big firms. I mean, I'm sure Perkins and Will and Gensler do a lot of pro bono work, which is very important to neighborhoods, but they have the deep pockets to be able to do that. You know, when you're sort of my size and my, tight budget, you really, anything you do should be an investment in jobs that will support your mission and help meet your budget. So that's in there. Deferred fee is probably the most I would say that's the #1 way of doing these projects.
The second part of that.
Yes.
It's something I've kind of been looking at. I've had that title before when I worked with BC doing one of the little free library projects of designer. But
Yes.
being a visual artist coming into something like this, I'm still trying to figure out how to connect where you fall in that as a designer. Because it seems as though, and I remember Eric asking about how are we defining that? Because
Yes.
we have these different kind of ideas on that.
Yes.
So I kind of wondered, where do we fall in that?
Well, I now designate all of you public interest designers, okay? So feel free to use that term, and use that term to mean whatever you need it to mean. I think it does, I think we've talked about all the different roles needed, and whatever role you're playing to accomplish those goals. It's really about accomplishing the goals of the public rather than like what I get to put after my name. Although after you pass the exam, you get to put seed after your name. So there you go. Now you have. But no, I don't know. I mean, we made up this term because we didn't have a term that fit. So you're creative. Come up, public interest artist. I don't know. Yes.
How did you make the transition from your art history major to where you are now?
Okay. So I love my art history degree. I mean, I think I'm able to see certain things from a different perspective because of my art history degree. Sambo said I was omniscient, and I'm like, no, I just have an art history degree. It's not that. But so, it put me into architecture. It sort of got me interested in architecture. But now it's a very different thing. It allows me to sort of see the way this is unfolding, see where it might go, see what happens in the beginning of movements, even like, the Renaissance or whatever, postmodernism. You look at how they begin and how they grow and then how they go, how they can go down. And so you know, what you want is that continued growth. So partly that's why I'm here talking to you all. I want that continued growth, right? How do we make this continue to grow? We've got a lot of work to do. 98% of the world, we've got to keep this growing. So for me, art history sort of gave me that perspective of what's happening. And, you know, one of the great things it did for me too is to also realize that this is not a form-based movement, okay? And actually in 2000, when I started the Structures for Inclusion conference, the Rural Studio was just the hottest thing going. And it's really easy to copy Sambo's style. I don't know if you know who Sambo was, but the guy I worked for. He has a very unique style, easy to copy. And he was the hottest thing going. And if at that moment everybody had started copying his style, his form, and lost the content, guess what? Slam, crash. Because we would have the form without the content, it would be consumed and over. So the reason I did Structures for Inclusion #1, which had Sambo there, but we also had 8 other designers doing very different things. And what we had in common was not form, but was our public goals. So it's useful. Let's put it that way. Okay, oh, we're out of time. Well,
On the outsourcing question was, I don't remember if it's just state, it says Texas or federal law that was reviewed, so where that's allowed for real estate. And so there are some businesses coming out with that help match funders and full projects, and there's one out of San Antonio, so that is becoming more available.
so what happens now?
We break for 10 minutes or so, and we'll have a concluding panel with all the case studies.
Okay, 10-minute break.